In the Misty Highlands of Inverness, where ancient secrets lurk in the fog, elderly sleuth Miss Jane Marple arrives at Glenmore House, invited by her troubled friend, Lady Elspeth MacTavish. Amid a cast of suspects, a debt-ridden artist nephew, his sharp nurse fiancée, a scheming archaeologist, and a resentful housekeeper, tensions boil over when the professor is found stabbed with his own ancient Pictish dagger. As whispers of forgery, hidden treasures, and blackmail echo through the moors, Miss Marple unravels a web of greed and betrayal. Clues like a planted glove, a forged note, and a staged cave lead to a shocking revelation. The loyal housekeeper, driven by twisted devotion, is the killer. In this Agatha Christie-inspired tale of human frailty, justice prevails, restoring peace to the haunted estate. But remember, in the shadows of the past, no secret stays buried forever. Chapter 1. The arrival at Glenmore House. The train from London pulled into Inverness station with a weary hiss of steam. The platform shrouded in a fine Highland mist that clung to everything like a persistent memory. Miss Jane Marple, her small suitcase in hand and her sensible hat pinned firmly against the breeze, stepped down onto the damp stones. At 74, she moved with a deliberate grace, her sharp blue eyes taking in the rugged landscape that stretched beyond the town. Rolling moors dotted with purple heather, distant peaks veiled in grey, and the faint glimmer of a loch under the overcast sky. The air carried a crisp, peaty tang that invigorated her, though she pulled her woolen shawl closer around her shoulders to ward off the chill. She had come at the invitation of Lady Elspeth MacTavish, an old-school friend whose recent letters had been laced with subtle undercurrents of distress. Vague mentions of family discord and unexplained anxieties at Glenmore House. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behaviour, had sensed something amiss, much as she had in those quiet troubles back in Chipping Cleghorn. A carriage waited at the station's edge, its horse stamping impatiently. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a tweed cap, introduced himself curtly as Angus, the estate's groundskeeper. His face was etched with lines from years of wind and weather, and he offered no small talk as he hefted her luggage into the back, his calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency. The journey to Glenmore House wound through narrow lanes flanked by stone walls and gorse bushes, the mist thickening as they ascended into the hills. Angus drove in silence, the clip-clop of hooves echoing against the quiet. Miss Marple gazed out at the scenery, noting how the isolation bred a certain introspection. It reminded her of how secrets festered in remote places, hidden from prying eyes. After half an hour, the house came into view, a grand brooding structure of weathered granite, its turrets piercing the fog like sentinels. Ivy crept up the walls, and the windows gleamed faintly, suggesting life within despite the sombre exterior. It had been the ancestral home of the MacTavish clan, passed to Lady Elspeth upon the death of her husband, Sir Roderick, 5 years prior. Lady Elspeth greeted her at the heavy oak door, her elegant figure clad in a tartan skirt and cream blouse, her silver hair swept into a neat chignon. "Jane, my dear, how good of you to come," she said, her voice warm but edged with fatigue, as she led Miss Marple into the high-ceilinged hall. The air inside was warmer, scented with wood smoke and lavender, and a grand staircase curved upward to shadowed landings. They proceeded to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the grate, casting flickering light on polished mahogany furniture and faded portraits of stern ancestors. Over afternoon tea served on delicate china, scones with clotted cream, shortbread fingers, and a pot of strong Darjeeling. Miss Marple met the rest of the household. First was Colin Drummond, Lady Elspeth's nephew, a tall young man in his 30s, with tousled dark hair and an artist's smock smeared with paint. He flashed a charming smile, but his eyes held a restless gleam, as if debts or dreams weighed on him. Beside him sat his fiancée, Fiona Grant, a poised woman from Edinburgh with striking red hair pinned back and a nurse's practical demeanour. Her green eyes assessed Miss Marple with quiet intelligence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Baird, bustled in with the tray, a stout figure in black with a face set in lines of perpetual disapproval, her Scottish burr thick as she murmured greetings. Completing the gathering was Professor Harlan Thorpe, a guest who had arrived a fortnight earlier to study nearby Pictish ruins. He was a lean man of middle age, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a beard streaked with grey, his tweed jacket pockets bulging with notebooks. He nodded politely, but seemed absorbed in a map spread across his lap, his fingers tracing ancient symbols with scholarly intensity. As conversation flowed, Lady Elspeth speaking of the estate's history, Colin jesting about Highland ghosts, Fiona inquiring after Miss Marple's journey. Miss Marple observed the subtle dynamics. Colin's hand brushed Fiona's a touch too possessively. Lady Elspeth twisted her pearl necklace absently. Thorpe's gaze flicked occasionally to the others with a calculating air, and Mrs. Baird lingered in doorways, her ears attuned to every word. As dusk fell and the mist pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest, the group dispersed briefly before dinner. Miss Marple retired to her room, a cosy chamber with a four-poster bed and views of the moors, to unpack. But soon raised voices drifted from the library below, sharp accusations about forged documents, murmurs of concealed wealth. She paused by her door, knitting bag in hand, listening without shame. Such echoes often revealed more than polite chatter. Descending quietly, she settled in an armchair by the hall fire, her needles clicking softly as she pondered the tensions. People, she reflected, were puzzles wherever one found them, their motives as layered as the fog outside. The evening meal promised further revelations, but for now, the Highland night enveloped Glenmore House in watchful silence. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Past. The following morning dawned with a clarity that seemed to mock the previous day's enveloping mist. Sunlight streamed through the mullioned windows of Glenmore House, gilding the dew-kissed moors and turning the distant loch into a mirror of polished silver. Miss Jane Marple awoke refreshed, the Highland air having chased away the fatigue of her journey. She dressed in her customary neat attire, a tweed skirt, sturdy shoes, and a cardigan against the lingering chill, and made her way downstairs, where the aroma of fresh porridge and kippers wafted from the kitchen. Lady Elspeth was already in the breakfast room, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, her face drawn but composed. "Good morning, Jane," she said, rising to greet her guest with a faint smile. "I trust you slept well. The beds here are ancient but comfortable in their way." Miss Marple assured her that she had indeed, and accepted a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. The room was bright, with French doors opening onto a terrace overlooking the gardens, where late-blooming roses clung defiantly to thorny stems. After breakfast, Lady Elspeth suggested a stroll along the paths that wound through the estate's grounds. "The air will do us both good," she remarked, linking arms with Miss Marple as they stepped out into the crisp morning. The path meandered through patches of heather, their purple blooms swaying gently in the breeze, and skirted the edge of a birch wood, where leaves rustled like whispers. Birds called from the branches, chaffinches and wrens, Miss Marple noted, much like those in her own garden back home. As they walked, Lady Elspeth's conversation turned confiding, her voice lowering as if the very landscape might overhear. "It's been a trying time, Jane. Since Roderick's passing, the house feels shadowed. He was a good man, but his affairs were tangled. The will left everything to me, the estate, the investments, but Colin, my nephew, insists there's a codicil that alters things in his favour. He's been pressing me about it, and I fear it's driving a wedge between us." She paused, plucking a sprig of heather and twirling it between her fingers. "And then there's Professor Thorpe. He's been excavating those old Pictish sites nearby, unearthing stones and relics. But I suspect his interests go beyond scholarship. He's asked probing questions about Roderick's collection of antiquities, as if he believes there's something valuable hidden away." Miss Marple listened attentively, her steps measured on the uneven ground. "People often cling to such notions when fortunes are involved," she observed mildly. "It reminds me of a case in my village, where a disputed inheritance led to all manner of misunderstandings." Lady Elspeth nodded, her eyes distant. "Colin needs the money, you see. He's an artist, talented, but imprudent with finances. His engagement to Fiona is a bright spot, but even that seems strained lately." They reached a vantage point overlooking the loch, where the water lapped softly against rocky shores, and stood in companionable silence for a moment, the sun warming their faces. Returning to the house, they found the others assembling in the dining room for a late breakfast. Fiona Grant was efficiently arranging platters on the sideboard, her movements precise and economical, betraying her training as a nurse. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her red hair caught in a practical bun, and she greeted Miss Marple with a warm, if slightly reserved, smile. "I hope the walk was pleasant, Miss Marple. The views here are breathtaking on clear days." Colin Drummond lounged nearby, sketching on a pad with quick, fluid strokes, his dark eyes flicking occasionally toward the adjoining study, where a heavy safe squatted behind a portrait of Sir Roderick. He rose to pull out chairs for the ladies, his charm effortless but undercut by a faint air of distraction. Professor Harlan Thorpe arrived last, his boots caked with fresh mud from the moors, his face flushed with excitement. "A breakthrough this morning," he announced, helping himself to bacon and eggs. "I've uncovered a burial mound that could date back to the 7th century. A talk of gold, perhaps, or ceremonial daggers. The value, both historical and monetary, could be immense." His enthusiasm filled the room, but Miss Marple noted how the others reacted. Lady Elspeth's polite interest masked unease. Colin's sketch pencil paused mid-stroke. Fiona's gaze sharpened as if assessing a patient's symptoms. As the meal progressed, conversation ebbed and flowed. Thorpe dominated, expounding on Pictish symbols and their links to ancient clans, his voice resonant with academic fervour. Colin interjected with light banter, suggesting the professor might stumble upon buried treasure to solve all their woes. Fiona spoke little, but when she did, it was with insight, mentioning how modern medicine echoed ancient herbal remedies found in such sites. Mrs. Baird, the housekeeper, hovered at the edges, refilling cups with a dour efficiency. Miss Marple observed her closely. The woman's lips tightened whenever Fiona spoke, her eyes narrowing in what seemed like deep-seated resentment. An outsider, Mrs. Baird had muttered under her breath earlier, when Fiona had offered to help in the kitchen, a comment that spoke volumes about loyalties forged over years of service. The afternoon unfolded lazily, the sun holding its ground against gathering clouds. Miss Marple excused herself to explore the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes and glass cases displaying Sir Roderick's curiosities, fragments of Roman pottery, a Viking brooch, and several Pictish stones etched with enigmatic carvings. She perused the shelves, her fingers trailing over spines, but her mind was on the household's undercurrents. Colin and Fiona retreated to the garden, their heads close in murmured discussion, perhaps wedding plans or something more fraught. Lady Elspeth busied herself with correspondence at her desk, her pen scratching fitfully. Thorpe vanished back to his digs, promising to return for dinner with artifacts to show. As evening approached, the group reconvened in the drawing-room, where a fire roared against the encroaching dusk. Whisky was poured, peaty and golden, from a decanter, accompanied by plates of shortbread and oatcakes. The talk turned to Highland lore, prompted by Thorpe's tales of cursed relics unearthed from boggy graves. The ancients believed in blood oaths and vengeful spirits, he intoned, his spectacles glinting in the firelight. One wrong touch, and calamity follows. Colin laughed it off, raising his glass in mock toast, but Miss Marple saw his hand tremble slightly, the liquid sloshing. Fiona, seated beside him, placed a steadying hand on his arm, her expression one of quiet concern. Lady Elspeth shared a family anecdote about a McTavish ancestor who had hidden Jacobite gold during the '45 rebellion, only for it to vanish into legend. Some say it's still out there, buried under the moors, she said, her voice wistful. Mrs. Baird, serving the tray, snorted softly. Fairy tales for fools, she grumbled, but her eyes lingered on Thorpe with a mix of suspicion and something akin to fear. The professor leaned forward, eager. Legends often hold kernels of truth. With the right map, or the right will, one might uncover fortunes long forgotten. Miss Marple sipped her tea, preferring it to spirits, and listened, her knitting emerging from her bag like an old friend. The needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the crackling logs. She recalled similar evenings in her own circles, where casual words masked deeper intents. Here, amid the tartan rugs and mounted stagheads, the same human frailties played out. Greed veiled as curiosity, jealousy simmering beneath courtesy. Colin's jests grew forced, Fiona's poise hid watchful eyes, Lady Elspeth's laughter rang hollow. Even Angus, the groundskeeper, appeared briefly at the window, his silhouette dark against the twilight before vanishing into the night. As the hour grew late, Miss Marple retired to her room, the corridors echoing with her soft footsteps. From her window, she watched the moon rise over the loch, casting silvery paths on the water. Her mind pieced together the day's fragments. The disputed codicil, Thorpe's excavations, the housekeeper's grudge. It was like assembling a jigsaw from scattered pieces, each edge hinting at connections yet unseen. Back in her quiet village life, amid the hedgerows of Chipping Cleghorn or the lanes of another such place, she had learned that shadows from the past often foretold storms to come. Here in the Highlands, those shadows loomed larger, deepened by the mist that began to creep back across the moors. Sleep came eventually, but not before she wondered what revelations the morrow might bring. Chapter 3. The Fatal Discovery. The serenity of the Highland morning was shattered by a piercing scream that echoed through the corridors of Glenmore House like a banshee's wail. Miss Jane Marple, who had been enjoying a quiet cup of tea in her room, while gazing out at the sun-dappled moors, set down her saucer with a start. The sound came from below, raw and urgent, cutting through the household's usual hush. She hurried downstairs as quickly as her age allowed, her sensible shoes tapping on the polished oak floors, arriving in the breakfast room to find chaos unfolding. Fiona Grant stood in the doorway, her face ashen, one hand clutching the frame for support. Her nurse's composure had cracked, her eyes were wide with shock, and her red hair had escaped its bun in dishevelled strands. "It's Professor Thorpe," she gasped, her voice trembling. "In the library! He's dead!" The words hung in the air, freezing the assembled group. Lady Elspeth, who had been buttering a slice of toast, dropped her knife with a clatter, her hand flying to her mouth. Colin Drummond leapt to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, his artist's pallor turning ghostly. Mrs. Baird, entering from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, halted abruptly, the pot tilting dangerously in her grip. Without a word, Colin bolted toward the library, Fiona close behind, her professional instincts kicking in despite the horror. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, noting how Lady Elspeth rose unsteadily, leaning on the table for balance. The library door stood ajar, and as they entered, the scene assaulted their senses. Professor Harlan Thorpe lay slumped forward over the mahogany desk, his body limp, a dark stain spreading across the back of his tweed jacket. Protruding from between his shoulder blades was a slender, ornate dagger, one of the Pictish artifacts he had proudly displayed the evening before, its hilt carved with intricate spirals and embedded with what appeared to be ancient gemstones. Blood had pooled on the desk, soaking into scattered papers and dripping onto the Persian rug below, where it formed irregular patterns like spilled ink. Fiona knelt beside the body, her fingers pressing against Thorpe's neck in a futile search for a pulse. "He's gone," she confirmed, her voice steady now, though her hands shook as she withdrew them. "Stabbed, straight through the heart, I'd wager. No signs of struggle beyond this." Colin paced the room, his eyes darting wildly, avoiding the gruesome sight. "Who could have done this? He was fine last night, arguing about those blasted ruins." Lady Elspeth sank into a nearby armchair, fanning herself with a handkerchief, her pearls clicking nervously. Mrs. Baird, having set down the coffee pot, crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Gaelic, her stern features etched with genuine dismay. Miss Marple remained near the threshold, her keen eyes sweeping the room methodically. The library was as she remembered it, shelves groaning under tomes of history and archaeology, glass cases now open where the dagger had been housed. The safe in the corner gaped wide, its contents rifled, documents strewn about, some crumpled as if grasped in haste. A window overlooked the misty gardens, but it was latched shut, no signs of forced entry. The fire in the grate had burned low to embers, suggesting the deed had occurred hours earlier, perhaps in the dead of night. She noted an overturned inkwell, its contents mingling with the blood, and a single footprint in the rug's fringe, muddy as if from the moors. Word spread quickly. Angus, the groundskeeper, was summoned from the stables, his boots leaving fresh tracks as he entered, his weathered face impassive. "Heard naught unusual," he grunted when questioned by Colin. "Patrolled till midnight, then bedded down." The household gathered in stunned silence until the authorities arrived. Inspector Hamish Lachlan of the Inverness Constabulary pulled up in a black sedan, accompanied by a sergeant and a medical examiner. Lachlan was a solid man in his 50s, with a bushy moustache and a kilted uniform that lent him an air of traditional authority. He sealed the library with brisk efficiency, ushering everyone into the drawing room for statements. "Right then," Lachlan began, notebook in hand, his brogue thick but commanding. "Let's have the facts. Who found the body?" Fiona recounted her discovery. She'd entered the library to retrieve a book on herbal remedies that Thorpe had borrowed, only to stumble upon the horror. "The door was unlocked," she added. "I touched nothing but his pulse." Colin admitted to a late-night whiskey in the study adjacent, but claimed he'd retired around 11, hearing no disturbances. Lady Elspeth, trembling, said she'd taken a sleeping draught and slept soundly. Mrs. Baird insisted she'd been in her quarters after clearing dinner, though her eyes flicked uneasily toward the window. Angus, questioned last, shrugged. Saw a light in the library window round 10, but figured it was the professor at his maps. Inspector Lachlan nodded, jotting notes, then turned to Miss Marple. "And you, ma'am? A visitor, I understand." She smiled faintly, her demeanour unassuming. "I heard nothing untoward, Inspector. But I did notice the dagger last evening. Professor Thorpe called it a rare find, said to be cursed by old legends." Lachlan raised an eyebrow but pressed on, examining motives as the medical examiner confirmed death by stabbing. Time estimated between midnight and 3 a.m. As the day wore on, revelations trickled out under Lachlan's probing. Thorpe had quarrelled with Colin over dinner about alleged forgeries, Colin's paintings, which Thorpe dismissed as clever imitations to fund debts. "He threatened to expose me," Colin confessed, fists clenched. "But I didn't kill him." Fiona revealed a tense exchange with Thorpe. He'd accused her of misplacing a vial of sedative from her medical bag, implying theft. "It was nothing," she said firmly. "He was paranoid about his health." Lady Elspeth admitted financial strains. Thorpe had hinted at knowing of her risky investments in antiquities, perhaps tied to the estate's dwindling funds. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, absorbed it all. The inspector dusted for fingerprints, but the dagger's hilt yielded only smudges. Gloves, perhaps? A search of Thorpe's pockets produced a crumpled note. "The artifact is mine. Return it, or suffer the consequences." Lachlan held it up. Blackmail, or a threat? The group exchanged glances. No one claimed knowledge. Outside, the mist began to roll in again, cloaking the moors in grey, as if nature itself conspired to hide clues. By afternoon, the body was removed, shrouded and sombre, to the Inverness morgue. The household dispersed uneasily, Colin to his studio, sketching furiously as if to exorcise demons, Fiona to organise her thoughts in the garden, Lady Elspeth to her room with a migraine. Mrs. Baird busied herself in the kitchen, her movements sharp and defensive. Angus returned to his duties, muttering about interlopers bringing ill luck. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, conversing softly with Inspector Lachlan. "It's curious, isn't it?" she mused. "The safe rifled, yet nothing obviously missing. And that note, Written on estate stationery, I believe. Lachlan grunted appreciatively. "Sharp eye, miss. We'll check for matches." Alone later, she pondered the parallels to a poisoning in her acquaintances' circle, where greed and resentment intertwined like ivy. Here, amid the Highland isolation, the same poisons brewed: ambition, fear, hidden agendas. The dagger, symbolic of ancient betrayals, pointed to a modern one. As evening shadows lengthened, she resolved to watch closely. The killer, she sensed, was not yet done weaving their web. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Mist. The mist descended upon Glenmore House with an almost deliberate stealth, rolling in from the loch like a living entity, muffling sounds and blurring the boundaries between the estate and the wild moors beyond. By mid-morning, the world outside had transformed into a ghostly veil, where shapes loomed indistinctly and the air hung heavy with damp. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The murder of Professor Thorpe cast a pall over the household, turning every glance suspicious and every word weighted. Inspector Hamish Lachlan had established a makeshift headquarters in the study, his sergeant methodically cataloguing evidence while constables patrolled the grounds. The dagger, now bagged and labelled, had been sent to Inverness for further analysis, its ancient blade confirmed as the murder weapon, though the smudged prints offered no immediate leads. The note from Thorpe's pocket, with its ominous warning about the artifact, lay on the desk under scrutiny. "Handwriting doesn't match any samples we've taken," Lachlan confided to Miss Marple as she entered, her knitting bag slung over her arm like a talisman. "But the paper's from the house stock. Anyone could have used it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, settling into a chair by the window where she could observe the mist-shrouded gardens. "It's often the small things, Inspector," she remarked mildly, "like that muddy footprint in the library rug, fresh as if from the night before. And the safe, rifled, yet Lady Elspeth says nothing valuable was taken. Perhaps it was a ruse to suggest robbery." Lachlan stroked his moustache, eyeing her with newfound respect. "You've a keen mind, miss. We're checking alibis more closely now." The interrogations resumed in earnest. Fiona Grant was called first, her nurse's uniform replaced by a simple wool dress that accentuated her composed demeanour. Seated across from Lachlan, she folded her hands in her lap. "I retired early last night," she stated calmly. "Colin and I spoke briefly in the hall. About our future, nothing more. I heard no unusual noises." But under pressing, she admitted to the missing sedative vial. "Professor Thorpe confronted me yesterday afternoon. He thought I'd taken it from my bag, but I hadn't. It must have been misplaced during his insomnia treatment." Lachlan leaned forward. "And if overdosed, could it have weakened him before the stabbing?" Fiona's eyes flashed. "Possible, but irrelevant. The wound was fatal on its own." Next came Colin Drummond, his artist's hands stained with charcoal from a morning sketch session that seemed more evasion than inspiration. He slumped in the chair, running fingers through his dishevelled hair. "Thorpe was a pompous fool," he burst out, accusing me of forging my own work to pay off loans, as if he'd know art from artifact. We argued, yes, but I left him alive. His alibi hinged on a late-night walk on the moors, claimed to clear his head, but with the mist, visibility was nil. "Ask Angus," he suggested defensively. "He might have seen me." Lachlan noted the receipt Colin produced earlier. A repayment to Thorpe, dated the murder day. "Convenient," the inspector muttered. "We'll verify the bank." Lady Elspeth followed, her elegance frayed by strain, a lace handkerchief twisted in her grip. "I slept poorly, even with the draught," she confessed. "Dreams of Roderick, and those old feuds Thorpe droned on about. But I didn't leave my room." She hesitated when asked about the codicil. "Colin believes it exists, favouring him with a share of the estate. But Roderick never mentioned it to me. Thorpe hinted he knew something, perhaps from his digs." Her voice dropped. "He spoke of buried secrets, as if taunting me." Miss Marple, listening from her corner, recalled a similar inheritance tangle in a neighbour's family, where whispers of lost documents hid deeper deceptions. Mrs. Baird entered with a tray of tea, her presence both servile and intrusive. Lachlan waved her to sit. "You were in the kitchen late," he said. "Hear anything?" The housekeeper's face hardened. "Only the wind, sir. And that Fiona clattering about earlier, always meddling where she's not wanted." Her disdain was palpable. She viewed the nurse as an interloper, threatening the household's order. The professor was a troublemaker, digging up the past, but murder? That's the devil's work. As she left, Miss Marple noted her glance toward the moors, where Thorpe's excavation site lay hidden in the fog. Angus, the groundskeeper, was summoned next, his boots leaving damp prints on the carpet. He stood rigidly, cap in hand. "Patrolled till the wee hours," he growled. "Saw a figure by the ruins round midnight. Couldn't make out who, with the mist. Heard whispers, like ghosts arguing." Lachlan pressed. "Whispers? About what?" Angus shrugged. "Artifacts, maybe. Sound carries queer in the fog." He admitted to disliking Thorpe. City man, desecrating sacred ground, but denied harm. Miss Marple pondered his words. Whispers in the mist could mask many sins. As the afternoon waned, the group was allowed brief respite. Miss Marple joined Lady Elspeth in the conservatory, where potted ferns drooped under the grey light. "These mists remind me of veils," Miss Marple said softly, "hiding truths until one parts them." Lady Elspeth sighed. Thorpe's journal mentioned a cave by the loch, a possible trove from the Jacobite era. "He showed me a map yesterday, excited as a boy." Intrigued, Miss Marple suggested a search. Colin volunteered eagerly, donning a coat and lantern, with Fiona insisting on accompanying him for safety. They ventured into the fog, their forms swallowed quickly. Hours passed tensely. Inspector Lachlan pored over Thorpe's journal, deciphered in the library entries on Pictish curses, sketches of relics, and cryptic notes about the McTavish hoard. Proof in the codicil. A breakthrough. Fibres on the dagger matched gloves from the estate's gardening shed. Anyone's access, Lachlan grumbled. Miss Marple examined a sample. But worn thin, used often, perhaps by someone familiar with the grounds. Colin and Fiona returned as dusk deepened, drenched and empty-handed. "The cave's entrance was collapsed," Colin reported, his clothes torn from brambles. "No sign of treasure." Fiona, shivering, added, "But we found this, snagged on a rock." She produced a scrap of tweed, matching Thorpe's jacket. He must have been there recently. Lachlan bagged it, eyes narrowing at Colin's dishevelled state. Dinner was a sombre affair, served in the dining room under flickering candlelight, the mist pressing against the panes like eavesdroppers. Conversation was sparse. Accusations hung unspoken. Mrs. Baird clattered plates irritably, her gaze accusatory toward Fiona. "Outsiders bring naught but grief," she muttered. Colin toyed with his food, Fiona solicitous beside him. Lady Elspeth retired early, pleading exhaustion. Miss Marple lingered by the fire, knitting a complex pattern that mirrored her thoughts. The day's whispers, literal and figurative, wove a tapestry. The missing vial, the forged receipt, the collapsed cave. It evoked a case from her past where a staged accident concealed passion's fury. Here, in the Highland isolation, motives intertwined like the mist's tendrils. Greed for artifacts, resentment of intruders, fear of exposure. As night fell, a distant howl pierced the fog. A fox, perhaps, or imagination. But Miss Marple knew the real predators were closer, their secrets whispering just beyond reach. Chapter 5. The Web Tightens. The mist that had cloaked Glenmore House the previous day lingered into the next morning, thinning sporadically to reveal patches of sodden moorland before closing in again like a noose. Inside, the air grew thicker with suspicion, each member of the household moving through the rooms as if under invisible scrutiny. Inspector Hamish Lachlan had extended his stay, commandeering the study for ongoing inquiries. His presence a constant reminder that the killer remained among them. Constables guarded the entrances, their boots echoing on the stone flags, while the medical examiner's report arrived by courier. Thorpe's death confirmed as instantaneous from the dagger wound. No traces of sedative in his system, despite the missing vial. Miss Jane Marple rose early, drawn by the clatter from the kitchen, where Mrs. Baird prepared breakfast with vehement energy, her knife chopping vegetables as if meting out judgment. Joining her for a moment, Miss Marple commented on the fine porridge. "A sturdy meal for uncertain times," she said gently. Mrs. Baird paused, her eyes reddened from lack of sleep. "Aye, miss, but uncertainty breeds malice. That nurse, always poking about with her potions. If you ask me, she's the one." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, filing away the bitterness. Such animosities often stemmed from perceived threats to one's domain. In the breakfast room, the group assembled uneasily. Lady Elspeth appeared fragile, her hands unsteady as she poured tea. Colin Drummond sketched absent-mindedly on a napkin, his lines jagged and abstract. Fiona Grant maintained her poise, though shadows underlined her eyes. Inspector Lachlan entered midway, his moustache bristling with purpose. "Developments," he announced, holding up a telegram. "The bank confirms Colin's receipt, genuine, but the funds were withdrawn from Thorpe's account hours before his death. Care to explain, Mr. Drummond?" Colin's face drained of colour. "He gave me the money willingly to settle our dispute. Ask Fiona. She witnessed the exchange." Fiona corroborated swiftly. "It was in the garden yesterday afternoon. Thorpe seemed eager to resolve it." But Lachlan's gaze sharpened. "And the torn clothes from your cave excursion? Brambles, you said. Yet our constable found no such overgrowth near the entrance." Colin faltered. "I wandered off the path. The mist disoriented me." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, observed the exchange. It echoed a forgery scandal she'd known, where alibis unravelled under pressure. The inspector turned to Fiona next, his tone probing. "Your glove, miss, found bloodied in the stables. Explain that." Fiona's composure held, but her knuckles whitened on her cup. "It was from my medical kit, yes, but stolen. I noticed it missing 2 days ago. Anyone could have taken it." Lachlan produced the item in a sealed bag. "Fibres match the dagger's hilt. And your quarrel with Thorpe over the sedative?" She met his eyes steadily. "He was mistaken. I treated his insomnia legitimately. As for the glove, perhaps the killer planted it to implicate me." Mrs. Baird, clearing plates, snorted audibly. "Convenient excuses," she muttered, earning a stern look from Lachlan. Lady Elspeth, sensing the net closing, interjected tremulously. "Inspector, surely this is all conjecture. Harlan was difficult, but we are family here." Lachlan softened slightly. "Family can harbour the deepest grudges, my lady. Your investments, Thorpe knew of losses from antiquities deals gone sour. Did he pressure you?" She flushed. "He advised me, nothing more. Roderick's collection was his passion. I merely preserved it." Miss Marple interposed mildly. "Preservation can be a burden. Like that widow in my acquaintance who guarded heirlooms at great cost." Lady Elspeth's eyes met hers gratefully, but the admission hung in the air. As the morning progressed, Lachlan orchestrated a reconstruction in the library. Each person reenacted their movements from the fatal night, the room still bearing faint metallic scents despite cleaning. Colin demonstrated retiring to his studio, Fiona to her room, Lady Elspeth ascending the stairs. Mrs. Baird mimed kitchen duties, her path crossing the hall. Angus, called in, paced the perimeter outside, lantern in hand. Miss Marple watched from the sidelines, noting discrepancies. Mrs. Baird's route allowed a detour to the library unnoticed. Colin's studio window overlooked the moors, perfect for a clandestine exit. A constable arrived with news from the excavation site. Tools disturbed, a fresh pit suggesting recent digging. Thorpe's map led there, Lachlan mused. Perhaps the killer sought the artifact after the deed. He dispatched men to search, but the mist hampered efforts. Meanwhile, Miss Marple slipped away to Thorpe's guest room, left unsealed after initial inspection. Amid his belongings, notebooks filled with runes, a magnifying glass, she found a loose floorboard. Beneath lay a hidden compartment, letters from a London dealer accusing Thorpe of peddling fakes. "So the professor wasn't above deceit," she murmured, replacing them carefully. Lunch was tense, served in the dining room under overcast skies. Conversation faltered. Fiona pushed, food around her plate. Colin drank more whiskey than ate. Lady Elspeth excused herself midway, citing a headache. As plates were cleared, Lachlan confronted Mrs. Baird in the pantry. "Your fingerprints on the safe, Mrs. Baird. Overlooked initially, but clear now." The housekeeper bristled. "I dusted it daily. My duty." But her voice wavered. "And your resentment toward Miss Grant," he pressed. "She's no kin, meddling in affairs not hers, but I'd not kill for it." Miss Marple, overhearing from the hall, pondered the web's strands, the planted glove, the forged artifacts, the disputed codicil. Joining Lady Elspeth in her boudoir, she probed gently. "Elspeth, these old houses hold echoes. Was there more to Roderick's will?" Lady Elspeth sighed, sinking onto a chaise. "I altered a minor clause. To curb Colin's extravagance, Thorpe discovered it, threatened exposure unless I funded his digs. But I refused." Her confession spilled like released floodwaters. "I feared ruin, but murder, never." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Fear drives desperate acts, but truth untangles them." Afternoon brought a storm, rain lashing the windows as thunder rumbled over the loch. The search party returned soaked, bearing a mudded box from the cave, unlocked, empty save for shale fragments. "Looted," Lachlan declared. "The killer got there first." Accusations erupted in the drawing room. Colin pointed at Angus. "You know the moors best." Fiona at Mrs. Baird. "Your grudge is poison." Lady Elspeth wept silently. The housekeeper retorted fiercely, I've served this house loyally, unlike some gold diggers." Chaos reigned until Lachlan restored order. Miss Marple retreated to the conservatory, her knitting a steady rhythm amid the downpour, piecing clues. The empty box suggested staging. The letters exposed Thorpe's fraud, the glove a clumsy frame. It paralleled a theft in her village circle, where misdirection concealed loyalty's dark side. As evening approached, Lachlan announced plans for arrests if no confession came. The web tightened, threads pulling taut, ready to ensnare. Dinner passed in stifled silence, the storm abating to drips from eaves. Afterward, in the library, now unsealed, Miss Marple examined the scattered papers anew. Among them, a forged appraisal for a Pictish relic in Thorpe's hand. "He planned to swindle," she whispered. A noise at the door, Fiona entering quietly. "Can't sleep," she said. "This place feels cursed." They talked softly of futures disrupted, Fiona revealing her own secret, a past error in nursing hushed up. Thorpe knew, threatened to tell Colin. Miss Marple listened, adding another knot. Night deepened, the house creaking under wind. Miss Marple lay awake, mind racing. The killer's motive crystallized, not mere greed, but protection twisted into vengeance. Tomorrow, she sensed, the strands would snap. Chapter 6. Revelations by the Loch. The storm's remnants lingered into the following day, leaving the skies leaden and the bare moors sodden underfoot. But the mist had lifted enough to reveal the stark beauty of the Highlands once more. Glenmore House felt like a pressure cooker, its inhabitants simmering with unspoken accusations, as Inspector Hamish Lachlan prepared for what he termed the final unravelling. He had summoned the household to the drawing-room that evening, declaring an arrest imminent, his burly frame commanding the space as he paced before the fireplace. The logs crackled fitfully, casting elongated shadows that danced across the tartan carpets and ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed to judge the living. Miss Jane Marple arrived early, settling into her accustomed armchair with her knitting bag at her feet. She had spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, wandering the waterlogged paths by the loch, where the cave's entrance now gaped like a wound in the earth. The empty box recovered from there nagged at her. Its pristine condition suggested it had been placed recently, not weathered by time. Returning, she had conversed briefly with Angus in the stables, his gruff manner yielding snippets of local lore, tales of smugglers' caches and clan betrayals that echoed the current intrigue. "The loch keeps secrets," he'd said, sharpening a scythe with deliberate strokes, "but they surface eventually." As the others filed in, the tension was palpable. Lady Elspeth took her place on the settee, her pearls clutched like a rosary, her face pale against the crimson upholstery. Colin Drummond lounged against the mantel, attempting nonchalance but betraying nerves with a twitching foot. Fiona Grant sat erect, her nurse's training evident in her controlled breathing, though her green eyes darted warily. Mrs. Baird hovered at the periphery, arms crossed over her ample bosom, her expression a mask of defiant loyalty. Angus remained outside, per Lachlan's orders, but his presence loomed through the window where rain pattered softly. Inspector Lachlan cleared his throat, his voice booming in the hushed room. "We've pieced together enough to name the culprit," he announced, holding up Thorpe's journal like a trophy. The professor was no saint. His letters reveal a scheme to forge artifacts and sell them through shady dealers. He targeted this estate, believing the McTavish hoard real, and blackmailed Lady Elspeth over her altered will. Lady Elspeth gasped, but Lachlan continued. The dagger was his own, used against him in irony. The glove, the note, all planted to mislead. And the cave, staged to suggest treasure hunting gone awry. Eyes turned accusingly toward Colin, who straightened indignantly. Not me! I've alibis, Lachlan interrupted. Your receipt checks out, but your Moorwalks are suspect. And you, Miss Grant, the missing vial, the bloodied glove. Fiona's chin lifted. Planted, as I said, I'm no murderer. The inspector pivoted to Mrs. Baird. Your fingerprints on the safe, your grudge against outsiders. The housekeeper's face reddened. Lies! I've served faithfully. Miss Marple set down her knitting with a soft click, her voice cutting through the din like a gentle breeze dispersing fog. If I may, Inspector, it's rather like that unfortunate affair with the poisoned preserves in a household I knew. Appearances wove a deceptive tapestry, but the threads led to unexpected hands. The room fell silent, all eyes on the elderly lady whose unassuming demeanour belied her acuity. Lachlan nodded grudgingly. Speak your piece, miss. You've been observant. She began slowly, her tone conversational, as if discussing village gossip over tea. Professor Thorpe was indeed a fraudster, forging relics to fund his lifestyle. His journal notes appraisals that matched no genuine Pictish finds, clever imitations, much like Colin's alleged art forgeries, which Thorpe hypocritically condemned. Colin nodded vigorously. He planned to swindle Lady Elspeth, using her investments as leverage, and perhaps even the codicil as bait. But someone discovered his deceit. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. The confrontation occurred in the library that night. Thorpe was at his desk, rifling the safe for documents to bolster his claims. The killer entered, familiar, trusted, no forced entry. Words were exchanged, accusations of desecration, threats of exposure. In the heat, the dagger was seized from its case, a weapon of opportunity. Fiona interjected. But the glove, my glove. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, yes. Taken from your kit earlier, to cast suspicion. The note, too, forged on estate paper, its phrasing echoing Highland tales Thorpe spun. Lachlan leaned forward. Who then? Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Baird. It was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Baird? Your loyalty to Sir Roderick ran deep, deeper than mere service. The housekeeper stiffened, her hands clenching. Nonsense! But Miss Marple continued undeterred. You overheard Thorpe's blackmail of Lady Elspeth days ago, perhaps while dusting. Enraged, you confronted him. He laughed, revealed his forgeries, boasted of ruining the house you cherished. In the struggle, you stabbed him, defending the McTavish legacy, as you saw it. Evidence mounted in Miss Marple's recounting. Your fingerprints on the safe, not from dusting, but from that night, searching for incriminating papers after the deed. The muddy footprint matched your kitchen clogs, often worn outdoors for herbs, and the cave. You knew it from old stories, planted the empty box to suggest Thorpe's greed led elsewhere. The glove framed Fiona, whom you resented as a threat to Colin's inheritance, and thus the estate's future. Lady Elspeth whispered, But why Fiona? Miss Marple explained, Jealousy, dear. Mrs. Baird saw her as an interloper, much like Thorpe, and the missing sedative? Taken by you, perhaps to dose Thorpe first, but unused, hence no traces. Mrs. Baird's facade cracked, tears welling. He was vile, blackmailing her ladyship, defiling Sir Roderick's memory with fakes. Only meant to scare him. The dagger! It happened so fast. She sank into a chair, sobbing. I planted the clues to protect the family. Lachlan signalled his sergeant, who gently escorted her away. A confession, he said, impressed. How did you know, miss? Miss Marple picked up her knitting. Human nature, Inspector. Mrs. Baird's resentment boiled over. Loyalty twisted into vengeance. It reminds me of a devoted servant in another case, blinded by devotion. The room exhaled collectively. Colin embraced Fiona, relief etched on their faces. Lady Elspeth approached Miss Marple, grasping her hands. You've saved us, Jane. How can I thank you? As night fell, the loch gleamed under emerging stars, its revelations complete. Miss Marple retired, reflecting on the fragility of secrets. The Highlands, like her quiet villages, harboured passions that once stirred, demanded reckoning. Chapter 7. Farewell to the Highlands. The morning after the revelations broke with a hesitant sun, piercing the remnants of the storm clouds, and bathing the moors in a golden haze that promised renewal. Glenmore House, so recently a bastion of shadows and secrets, now hummed with a subdued energy as the constables wrapped up their duties, carting away evidence boxes and murmuring farewells. Inspector Hamish Lachlan stood in the hall, his moustache twitching and what passed for a smile, shaking hands with Lady Elspeth. "A tidy resolution, my lady," he said gruffly. "Thanks in no small part to your guest here." He nodded toward Miss Jane Marple, who stood nearby with her suitcase at her feet, her woolen shawl draped neatly over her arm. Mrs. Baird had been taken into custody the night before, her confession spilling forth like a dam burst, revealing years of pent-up devotion to the McTavish legacy. She had wept openly as the sergeant led her away, not for herself, but for the house she feared would crumble without her vigilant hand. "I did it for Sir Roderick's memory," she'd repeated, her stout frame deflating under the weight of regret. The household had retired in stunned quietude, each grappling with the betrayal born of misplaced loyalty. Now, in the light of day, the air felt cleansed, though echoes of the ordeal lingered in weary eyes and hushed tones. Lady Elspeth approached Miss Marple, her elegance restored somewhat by a fresh blouse and skirt, though faint lines of strain etched her features. She enveloped her old friend in a warm embrace, her voice thick with emotion. "Jane, I cannot express my gratitude. Without you, we might all have been ensnared in that dreadful web. You've given us a chance to heal." Miss Marple patted her back gently, her touch reassuring. "Nonsense, Elspeth. It was merely a matter of observing the patterns. People are much the same, whether in grand estates or modest cottages. Greed and fear weave similar threads everywhere." Lady Elspeth pulled back, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Stay longer. The moors are lovely in this light." But Miss Marple shook her head. "My train awaits, dear, and I've imposed long enough." Colin Drummond and Fiona Grant stood arm in arm on the terrace, the morning breeze ruffling Colin's hair and bringing colour to Fiona's cheeks. Cleared of suspicion, they seemed lighter, their engagement reaffirmed amid the chaos. Colin extended a hand to Miss Marple, his artist's grip firm. "You've saved more than our reputations, Miss Marple. Fiona and we can look to the future now, without those clouds hanging over us." Fiona nodded, her green eyes shining. "Indeed, your insight was remarkable. It's as if you saw straight through to the heart of things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hearts are transparent, once one learns to read them." Like that young couple in a village affair I recall. Accusations flying, but truth prevailing. They exchanged promises of visits, Colin sketching a quick portrait of Miss Marple on a scrap of paper as a memento, his lines capturing her quiet wisdom with surprising accuracy. Angus the groundskeeper appeared at the carriage, loading her luggage with his customary stoicism. His weathered face showed no trace of the drama's toll, though Miss Marple noted a subtle nod of respect as he helped her aboard. "Safe travels, miss," he muttered, tipping his cap. "The Highlands owe ye." She settled into the seat, the horse snorting impatiently as the carriage rolled down the gravel drive. Glancing back, she saw the house receding, its turrets proud against the sky, the loch glimmering beyond like a polished jewel. The moors stretched endlessly, heather blooming defiantly, a testament to resilience amid isolation. The journey to Inverness station passed in reflective silence, the landscape unfolding in layers of green and grey, punctuated by distant sheep and ancient standing stones. Miss Marple's mind wandered over the events, piecing them anew, not for clues, but for understanding. Thorpe's ambition had been his undoing, a man chasing phantoms of wealth through deception. Mrs. Baird's act, though criminal, stemmed from a fierce protectiveness, a distortion of duty that Miss Marple had witnessed in various guises, the overzealous guardian, the jealous retainer. It paralleled a case from her past, where a loyal maid had gone to extremes to shield her mistress, only to unravel the very fabric she sought to preserve. At the station, the platform bustled with travellers, kilted locals, tourists with cameras, the steam train huffing like an impatient beast. Miss Marple boarded, finding a window seat in a compartment shared with a kindly Scottish couple returning from market. As the whistle blew and the train lurched forward, she waved to no one in particular, the Highlands slipping away in a blur of mist-kissed hills. The rhythm of the rails soothed her, much like the click of her knitting needles, which she soon retrieved from her bag. A new scarf began to take shape, soft wool looping in intricate patterns that mirrored her thoughts. Human nature, she mused, remained constant across borders and terrains. In the misty expanses of Inverness, or the hedged lanes of her own quiet world, Chipping Cleghorn perhaps, or another such haven, the same impulses drove people. Love twisted into possession, fear manifesting as aggression, secrets burrowing like roots in fertile soil. Thorpe's death had exposed them all, but in solving it, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, not in the justice meted out, but in the clarity restored. Lives could mend, Lady Elspeth would manage the estate with renewed vigour, Colin and Fiona build their dreams unshadowed, even Angus continue his steadfast watch. The couple opposite engaged her in polite chatter, about the weather, the crops, a recent fair in Edinburgh. Miss Marple responded amiably, her observations keen as ever. The wife's brooch, a family heirloom perhaps, the husband's calloused hands speaking of honest labour. It reminded her that puzzles existed everywhere, not just in murders, but in the everyday tapestry of existence. As the train chugged southward, crossing borders into gentler landscapes, she allowed herself a small smile. Another enigma unravelled, the world incrementally safer, if only by the measure of one Highland household. Dusk fell as they neared London, the sky streaked with amber and rose. Miss Marple packed away her knitting, anticipating the familiarity of home, the neat garden, the village gossip, the unassuming routines that grounded her. Yet she carried a piece of the Highlands with her. The scent of peat, the whisper of mist, the lesson that isolation amplified frailties but also forged strengths. In her valise lay Colin's sketch, a token of gratitude, and in her memory the faces of those she'd helped. As the train pulled into the station with a final sigh, she stepped down, ready for whatever next intrigue life might present. For Miss Marple knew, with quiet certainty, that human puzzles were endless, and her role in solving them enduring.